Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, there is this, there's a very specific feeling you get when you're at a dinner party.
Oh, I know where this is going.
Yeah, you're maybe on your second glass of wine and someone brings up the Big Bang and the Book of Genesis in the exact same sentence.
Right. It's that immediate check, please feeling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is a brace for impact moment. Because we are so conditioned, culturally and educationally, to think that if you put faith and science in a room together,
They're going to fight.
the only possible outcome is a cage match. I mean, it's the Scopes monkey trial, it's Galileo in a dungeon, it's Richard Dawkins versus, well, basically everyone.
The warfare thesis.
Right.
That is the water we swim in.
Right. It's the idea that these two things are like matter and antimatter. They just cannot coexist without exploding. But I've been looking at the massive stack of research we have for today. We're looking at biographies of Nobel laureates, the history of the Royal Society, papers from the Faraday Institute.
A heavy stack.
It really is. And I'm realizing that this warfare story, it might actually be the most successful PR campaign in history.
It really is. And the kicker is that it's a relatively recent campaign, too. I think that's the hook for today's deep dive, because we assume this war has been raging since the dawn of time.
Right, since the first caveman looked up at the stars.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the conflict as we know it is largely a 19th century invention.
And to prove that, we have some numbers that, frankly, I just did not believe when I first read them. We're going to look at the 20th century.
The century of the atom bomb and the moon landing.
Yeah, the peak of scientific rationality, the mapping of the genome. And we're going to look at who was actually winning the Nobel Prizes during that time.
The statistic is wild. Between 1901 and 2000, 65.4% of Nobel laureates identified as Christian.
2/3. That just, it stops me in my tracks.
2/3. And if you add in identifying Jews and other religious groups, the number of strict atheists winning Nobel Prizes is actually a really small minority.
So with the smartest people in physics and chemistry and medicine,
People actually doing the science.
right, if they didn't see a conflict, why do we?
That is exactly the question.
And that is the mission today. For everyone listening, we're going deep into what the sources are calling the good faith dialogue. We're going to find out why the Big Bang was discovered by a priest,
Yep.
why the guy who mapped the human genome reads C.S. Lewis, and why the Dark Ages were actually, well, kind of bright.
And we are going to see that this isn't about one side winning. It's about a conversation that has been happening for centuries, which we have just completely forgotten how to listen to.
So let's dive in. I want to start with the myth busting. Let's call this section 1 dismantling the myth, because if this warfare idea is an invention, who invented it?
Right. Who do we blame?
Yeah, who are the guys we blame for the awkward dinner party conversations?
We largely blame two men, John William Draper and Andrew Dickson White.
I have never heard of them.
Most people haven't today, but you absolutely know their ideas. In the late 1800s, they wrote two massive bestsellers. Draper wrote The History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science.
Yes, catchy title.
Very on the nose.
Yeah.
And White wrote a similar one. And you have to understand, these books were the Da Vinci Code of their day. They completely established the narrative that throughout history, the church has been this villain holding back the heroic progress of science.
But why, though? I mean, usually when people write history books, they are trying to record what actually happened. Are you saying they had an agenda?
Oh, absolutely they did. You have to look at the context of the late 1800s.
Yeah.
Science was trying to professionalize.
What does that mean exactly?
Well, before this, scientist wasn't really a job title. You were a natural philosopher, and very often you were a clergyman.
Okay.
I mean, Charles Darwin was trained in theology. Isaac Newton wrote theology.
Yeah, the lines were super blurry.
Very blurry. And Draper and White wanted to draw a hard line. They wanted to create a professional class of scientists that was distinct from the clergy.
Ah.
And
Right.
historically speaking, the best way to unite a new group and give it a solid identity is to identify a common enemy.
So they painted the church as the enemy to help scientists unionize, essentially.
That is a cynical way to put it, but it's not entirely wrong. There was also a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment in America at the time,
Right.
and Draper specifically targeted Catholicism as the enemy of progress. But here is the kicker for you. Modern historians of science.
So people who study this for a living today.
Exactly. They have looked at Draper and White's work and basically said, this is garbage.
Garbage is a very strong academic term.
Well, they call it the conflict thesis. And today, it is considered a fringe view among serious historians.
Yeah.
The historical reality is just much messier. Sometimes they fought, sure,
Right, humans fight.
but more often they were independent or and this is what we're focusing on today, they were mutually supportive.
Mutually supportive. Okay, that sounds really nice, but how does that actually work in practice? I mean, let's be real here. One field relies on revelation. God told me this.
Right.
The other relies on observation. I saw this happen in a lab. Those feel like fundamentally different languages.
They are different languages, but the early scientists reconciled them using a very famous metaphor that kept popping up in our reading for this deep dive.
The two books metaphor.
Yes.
I highlighted this in the Worldview Bulletin article. Unpack this for us because I think it's crucial.
It goes back to the early church fathers, but Francis Bacon really popularized it at the start of the scientific revolution. The idea is that God is the author of two books.
Okay.
Book 1 is Scripture, the Bible. Book 2 is nature, the physical universe.
So 2 volumes, 1 author.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the logic is incredibly simple. If God is the author of both books, he cannot contradict himself. Truth cannot contradict truth.
Okay, I follow that.
So if you look at a rock stratum and it says the earth is very old, and you look at a Bible verse and you think it says the earth is very young.
The problem isn't the rock and the problem isn't God.
Right. The problem is your interpretation of one or the other.
So it gives you an out.
More importantly, it gives you permission. That is the key here. It gave early scientists the theological permission to study nature aggressively.
Because they weren't stepping away from God by studying beetles or stars.
Exactly. They were reading his other book. It frames science as a religious duty.
That is a brilliant framework. But I do want to push back on the history a bit here, because even if the philosophy was there, we all have this cultural mental image of the Dark Ages.
Oh, the Dark Ages.
So Rome falls, and then for 1,000 years, everyone just sits in the mud, being superstitious and afraid of witches, until suddenly the Renaissance happens. Are you saying that is all just Draper and white propaganda?
Mostly, yes. The term Dark Ages is something historians absolutely hate. They prefer the medieval period. And far from being a time of stagnation, our sources show it was a time of massive technological ferment.
And who was driving it?
The church.
See, give me an example of that. Because
Yeah.
when I think medieval church, I think of monks copying Bibles by candlelight in total silence. I definitely do not think innovation.
Then let's look at the Cistercian monks. These guys were essentially the industrial engineers of the 12th century.
Engineers.
We have sources here describing them as catalysts for the market economy. The Cistercians were completely obsessed with water power.
Really?
Yeah, when they built a new monastery, they didn't just look for a nice view or a quiet valley. They specifically looked for fast-moving water.
For drinking.
For power, they built incredibly complex dams and sluice gates. They used water power to crush wheat, sieve flour, full cloth, and tan leather.
Wait, full cloth, what does that actually mean?
Fulling. It is the process of cleaning and thickening raw wool. Traditionally, you did it by stomping on the wool in a massive vat of stale urine.
Oh, wow, that is a gross job.
A terrible job. But the Cistercians mechanized it. They built these massive trip hammers powered by water wheels to pound the cloth automatically. They were basically running factories.
So a monastery wasn't a quiet place of contemplation at all.
It was incredibly noisy. It was industrial. The ground would literally shake from the hammers. And they were diffusing this technology all across Europe.
So they were sharing the tech.
If you wanted to know how to build a state-of-the-art water wheel in 1200 AD, you went to the monks. They weren't hiding from the physical world. They were mastering it.
That completely flips the script. What about the universities, though? Because I always assume universities started as secular places of learning that eventually got religious, but it's the other way around, isn't it?
Completely the opposite. Oxford, Paris, Bologna, the grandparents of the modern university system, they grew directly out of medieval cathedral schools. The modern university is fundamentally a child of the church.
And the students, what were they, monks?
They were considered clerics. This is actually why we wear those long robes at graduation today, by the way.
No way!
Yeah, that is a medieval clerical gown. But more importantly, because they were clerics, they had what was called benefit of clergy. They had legal protection to think, to argue, and to debate controversial ideas.
So the church provided the safe space, to use a modern term, where the intellectual life could actually happen.
Exactly.
Okay, so the church built the sandbox. But did they actually let people play in it? Or was it more like, you can study but do not find anything we don't like?
Well, let's look at the Jesuits for a second. We're moving into the 16th and 17th centuries now. The sources call the Jesuits the single most important contributor to experimental physics in that era.
Experimental physics, not
And
theology.
Physics. Specifically, they were pioneering fields like optics, electricity, and magnetism. In fact, seismology, the study of earthquakes, is historically nicknamed the Jesuit science.
Why earthquakes? Why would monks care about that?
Because they had a massive global network of missionaries, and they were incredibly disciplined data collectors. They recorded seismic data all over the world. They were doing big data centuries before computers.
That's amazing.
They were teaching astronomy in China, bringing Euclidean geometry to the East. The idea that the church was trying to keep people stupid is just historically inaccurate. They were the ones building the observatories.
Okay, so we have the church building the universities and monks acting as industrial engineers. But I want to zoom in on the individuals now. Let's move to section 2. The priests in the temple of nature.
I love that phrase.
Because when we look at the giants of the scientific revolution, the common assumption you and I have is that they must have been secretly atheists, or at least they just kept their heads down to avoid getting in trouble with the bishop.
Right, the closet atheist theory. But when you actually read their private diaries, their letters to friends, it just doesn't hold up. Let's take Robert Boyle, for example.
Boyle's law. Pressure and volume. I remember that from high school chemistry.
Exactly. He is universally recognized as the father of chemistry. He is the guy who finally moved us from alchemy.
Trying to turn lead into gold.
Right. He moved us from that to actual rigorous chemistry. But Boyle was arguably more devout than your average priest.
How so?
He called himself a priest in the temple of nature. That was his own self-definition. He believed that doing a chemistry experiment was literally a form of worship.
Worship? Come on, that's a stretch. How is heating up gas in a glass tube worship?
Because for Boyle, it was all about the clockwork universe. He looked at the intricacies of gas pressure or the mechanics of a vacuum, and he saw a design that was so elegant it required a designer.
I see.
He believed that by revealing the mechanics of the physical world, he was directly glorifying the mechanic who made it.
So it wasn't, I do science on Monday and go to church on Sunday. It was, science is my church.
Yes, and he put his money where his mouth was, too. He personally funded the translation of the Bible into Gaelic and even into the Algonquin language for Native Americans in Massachusetts.
Oh, wow.
He definitely wasn't hiding his faith.
I noticed something really interesting in our notes about Boyle and his concept of doubt. Because today, if you ask someone on the street, we think of faith as absolute certainty.
Right.
But Boyle seemed to have a very different take on it.
This is a crucial nuance. Boyle believed that doubt was a corollary of faith. He believed that if you were studying the work of an infinite God, it should be hard.
It should be confusing.
Exactly. If you understood the universe instantly, that it wasn't grand enough to be divine. So he saw scientific struggle and theological struggle as a necessary part of the process.
That is incredibly refreshing. It's not blind faith, it's struggling faith.
Exactly. And then, of course, you have the big one, Sir Isaac Newton.
The man who basically wrote the rules of reality.
Principia Mathematica. It is maybe the most important book in the history of science. Now, Newton is a really interesting case because his personal theology was, well, unconventional.
How so?
He secretly denied the Trinity, but he's completely obsessed with God.
Obsessed.
He wrote far more words about biblical prophecy and theology than he ever did about physics. Millions of words.
Millions.
Yes.
Yeah.
But specifically regarding his science, there is a very common misconception. People think Newton figured out gravity and then said, okay, I can explain how the planets move now so I don't need God anymore.
The God of the gaps thing. As the gap in our scientific knowledge closes, God just gets squeezed out of the picture.
Right. But Newton felt the exact opposite. He looked at the solar system, all these planets moving in perfectly elliptical, concentric orbits, never crashing into each other, and he said, gravity explains the motion, but it does not explain the design.
So gravity is just the tool.
Exactly. He explicitly wrote that the regulation of the system presupposed the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being.
Gravity is the tool, but God is the user of the tool.
Precisely. And this leads to a linguistic point that honestly blew my mind when I first studied this. The word law.
Like the law of gravity, the laws of thermodynamics.
Right. Why do we call them laws? That is fundamentally a legal term, not a scientific one.
I literally never thought about that. I just assumed it meant a strict rule.
The historian John Hedley Brooke points this out in our sources. Early scientists, guys like Boyle, Newton, Descartes, they didn't use the word law as a metaphor. They believed they were literally discovering legislation.
And if there is legislation in the universe?
There must be a legislator. They were actively hunting for the physical statutes that the divine king had laid down to govern the realm. The very concept of a scientific law is deeply theological in its origin. You only look for universal, unbreakable laws if you believe there is a universal lawgiver who enforces them.
That is a heavy concept. It suggests that modern science actually needed that specific theological framework to even get off the ground.
It did. And this connects perfectly to Michael Faraday, too. We have the Faraday papers in our source stack for this deep dive, and paper number 13 is explicitly about him.
He's the electromagnetism guy, right?
Right. Electric motors, generators. He was a Sandemanian Christian.
A what?
Sandemanian, it was a very small, incredibly devout sect. And for Faraday, the laws of nature were directly linked to the faithfulness of God.
In what, exactly?
If God is perfectly faithful, then nature must be perfectly consistent. It shouldn't just change its rules on a Tuesday for no reason. This convergent model meant his religious faith actually made him a better scientist because he fundamentally trusted that there was a rational answer waiting to be found in the lab.
It sounds like a lot of this just comes down to their mindset, which leads us right into the Merton thesis.
Ah, yes, Robert K. Merton, the sociologist.
This part of the reading was fascinating. He argued that the scientific revolution wasn't just some random historical event. It was driven specifically by Protestants, Puritans, and Pietists. But why them?
It comes down to the Protestant work ethic.
Right.
And believe it or not, hands.
Hands, like physical hands.
Manual labor. See, in the ancient world, and even in the aristocratic Catholic world to some extent, manual labor was strictly for peasants. If you were a gentleman scholar, you sat in a comfortable chair and you thought deep thoughts.
You philosophized.
You didn't grind glass lenses, you didn't mix smelly chemicals, you didn't dissect things. That was considered dirty.
But science is inherently dirty.
Experimental science is very dirty. You have to build the telescope yourself. You have to dissect the frog. The Protestants, particularly the Puritans, viewed physical labor as deeply virtuous. They completely sanctified the work of the hands.
So they were willing to get their hands dirty for God.
Exactly. Combined with their theological idea that they needed to restore the natural knowledge that was lost during the fall of man, it created a culture where tinkering, building, and experimenting was a holy calling.
The lab coat wasn't just a protective garment, it was a vestment.
That is a perfect way to put it.
Okay, I can hear the listeners screaming at their speakers right now. You are doing great, but they're saying this is all very nice. You are cherry-picking the happy stories. What about Galileo?
I knew this was coming. We have to talk about Galileo. Let's call this section 3, the Galileo exception.
It is the ultimate weapon in the warfare argument. The story goes, Galileo proves the Earth goes around the sun, the church says no, the Bible says the sun moves, and they throw him in a dark dungeon to rot. How do you possibly defend that?
Well, to be clear, we don't defend the church's actions. It was an absolute PR disaster and a moral failure. But we do have to correct the history here, because the movie version we all know is just wrong.
So hit me with the historical reality.
First, let's look at the science. When Galileo was making his massive claims, did he actually have proof?
I always assume so. I mean, he had a telescope, he saw the moons of Jupiter.
He had observations that strongly suggested heliocentrism, but he fundamentally lacked the smoking gun. And the scientific smoking gun at the time was stellar parallax.
Parallax. Okay, explain that like I am 5 years old.
Okay. If the Earth is actually moving around the sun, then in June, we are on one side of the solar system, and in December, we are all the way on the other side.
Right.
That is a huge distance, millions of miles.
Yeah.
So when we look at the exact same stars from those two vastly different points, the angle should shift. Just like if you hold up your finger, close one eye, and then open the other, your finger seems to jump against the background.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. It's basic triangulation.
Exactly. The top astronomers of the time looked for this visual shift, and they found absolute nothing. The stars didn't move an inch.
Wait, why not? If the Earth is moving, they should shift.
Because the stars are incomprehensibly far away. The shift was technically there, but it was incredibly small, way too small for Galileo's primitive telescope to ever detect. So the established scientific community, which was deeply committed to Aristotle's physics, looked at Galileo and said, "You have a nice hypothesis, but the physical evidence proves the Earth is completely stationary."
So it wasn't just the Bible versus science. It was basically bad science versus good science, at least based on the tools they had at the time.
It was the scientific establishment which the church funded and supported versus the disruptor. And frankly, Galileo did not help his own case. He was, let's just say, abrasive.
Our notes basically say he was a troll.
He was definitely a bit of a troll. He wrote a book, written as a dialogue, explaining his new theory. And he put the Pope's personal arguments, the arguments of his friend and biggest patron, Pope Urban VIII, into the mouth of a foolish character named Simplicio.
Simplicio? which translates to
Templeton.
he basically called the Pope an idiot in a massive bestseller.
He did.
Okay, pro tip for you listeners, do not call the guy who runs both the country and the church a simpleton.
Exactly. So the famous trial was as much about petty politics, authority, and a personal betrayal of a friendship as it was about astronomy. And his punishment. He wasn't tortured. He wasn't thrown in a dungeon. He was sentenced to house arrest.
Which means what in 17th century Italy?
He lived in a very nice villa in the hills of Florence. He had servants. He continued to write. In fact, he wrote his most historically important work on physics, Two New Sciences, while he was under house arrest.
So he wasn't silenced at all.
He was publicly shamed, yes. It was deeply unjust. But he remained a committed Catholic his entire life. He believed in the two books until the day he died.
And there's a famous quote from him, right?
Yes, he famously quoted Cardinal Baronius. He said, "The intention of the Holy Spirit is to teach us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go."
That is such a great line. It effectively separates the two domains. The Bible is a manual for salvation. Science is a manual for mechanics.
And modern historians view Galileo as the exception to the rule. That is exactly why we all know his name. Think about it. If the church was constantly burning scientists at the stake, we would have a list of thousands of names. But we really just have Galileo. He is the tragic anomaly in a system that usually fully supported astronomy.
Wow. Let's jump forward from the 1600s all the way to the 1920s. We are moving to section 4, the Big Bang and the priest. Because if Galileo is the poster boy for warfare, this next guy should absolutely be the poster boy for peace. But nobody knows his name.
George Lemaître.
The actual father of the Big Bang. And he was a Catholic priest.
Wearing the clerical collar and everything. This story is honestly my favorite in the entire deep dive because it completely flips our modern assumptions on their head. Today, if you ask a random person on the street, does the Big Bang support religion or atheism? They will almost always say atheism.
Right, because it replaces the idea of creation. You don't need God to say, let there be light, if you just have a singularity expanding.
But back in the 1920s, it was the exact opposite. The entire scientific establishment, including Albert Einstein, strongly believed in a steady-state universe.
Meaning eternal. No beginning, no end, it's just always been there.
And why did they like that? Because an eternally existing universe does not need a creator. It just is. It is a very comfortable idea for materialists.
Enter Father Lemaître.
Right. Lemaître takes Einstein's own incredibly complex equations of general relativity, and he realizes, wait a minute. The math here implies the universe is actually expanding, and he reasoned if it is expanding outwards like a balloon and you just play the movie backward in time,
It gets smaller and smaller.
until you hit a single, infinitely dense point. A primeval atom, as he called it. A distinct beginning. A moment of creation.
And Einstein hated this.
He completely loathed it. He looked at Lemaître's paper and told him, your calculations are correct, but your physics is abominable.
Abominable.
Einstein actually thought Lemaître was secretly trying to sneak the book of Genesis into a physics class. He thought the whole Big Bang concept was just a Trojan horse for religious dogma.
That is just incredible to me. The greatest scientist in history completely rejected a valid theory because it smelled too much like theology.
Correct. But Lemaître kept the faith in the physics, He waited patiently for the empirical evidence. And eventually, Edwin Hubble proved the universe was in fact expanding by observing the redshift of distant galaxies. The hard evidence completely vindicated the priest.
Now, here's the historical twist that really shows what good faith character looks like. The Pope at the time, Pius XII, hears about this new discovery, and he gets very excited.
Oh, he gets extremely excited. Let there be light. The Pope wants to go on global radio and officially declare that modern science has finally, definitively proven the Catholic faith. He essentially wants to make the Big Bang an official church dogma.
And Lemaître, the humble priest who came up with the theory, should be thrilled by this, right? I mean, he is about to get the ultimate papal endorsement.
You would really think so. But Lemaître does something incredibly heroic here. He urgently contacts the Vatican and says, stop. Do not do this.
Why would he stop his own victory lap?
Because he deeply understood the critical distinction between the two books. He told the Pope, the Big Bang is just a scientific hypothesis. It might be true today, and it might be completely disproven by new data tomorrow. If you tie the eternal, unchanging truth of God to a physics theory that might change in 50 years, you are dangerously gambling with the faith.
He actively did not want a God of the gaps.
Exactly. He wanted the two paths of knowledge to remain distinct, but deeply respectful of each other. He famously said in a New York Times interview in 1933 that he had two paths to truth, and he followed them both simultaneously. He protected the integrity of science from the Pope, and he protected the integrity of theology from being anchored to a temporary physics model.
That is such a high integrity move. It is entirely about having humility in your own discipline.
Precisely.
So we've covered the deep history. Let's bring this right up to the present day. Section 5, contemporary synthesis. We have looked at physics and we've looked at chemistry. Now let's look at biology. Because for a lot of people listening to you right now, evolution is the final boss of this conflict.
Oh, without a doubt. And the man standing right in the middle of that arena today is Francis Collins.
For any listeners who don't know the name, who is Francis Collins?
He is an absolute scientific heavyweight. He was the director of the Human Genome Project.
Yeah.
He led the massive international team of scientists that successfully mapped the entire human DNA code, all 3 billion letters of it. He is a legendary gene hunter. He personally discovered the genes responsible for cystic fibrosis and Huntington's disease.
Okay, so he's not a fringe guy writing blogs. He is the scientific establishment.
He is the peak of the establishment. And he is also a deeply committed Christian. But he definitely wasn't always.
No, the sources outline his journey. He started out as a strict agnostic, basically bordering on a hard atheist.
He was a pure materialist. But when he was in medical school, he kept encountering these patients who were suffering terribly. Terminal cancer, chronic agonizing pain. And yet many of them had this profound, unexplainable peace. They weren't angry at the universe. They were totally serene.
That must have been really jarring for a materialist. I mean, if you believe we are just wet bags of chemicals reacting to stimuli, pointless suffering should just be pointless suffering.
Exactly. He couldn't explain their peace biologically. And one day, an older patient looked at him and asked, "Doctor, what do you believe?" And Collins realized he didn't have an answer. He felt intellectually dishonest. So, being a rigorous scientist, he decided he needed to research the data on religion. He ended up picking up Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis.
Lewis is a philosophical heavyweight in his own right. What specific argument hooked Collins?
It was the argument from the moral law. Lewis argued that across all human cultures and throughout all of recorded history, there is a universal human sense of right and wrong, a deep-seated sense of fairness, of altruism.
But wouldn't evolutionary psychologists just say altruism is a basic survival mechanism? Like we help our monkey tribe so our monkey genes survive to the next generation.
That is the selfish gene theory, right? But Collins looked at instances of radical altruism, like a soldier jumping on a live grenade to save a total stranger, or Mother Teresa devoting her entire life to caring for the dying poor in Calcutta who could never possibly help her back. That kind of radical altruism does not help your personal genes survive. In fact, jumping on a grenade completely ends your genetic line.
So from a purely biological standpoint, it's an evolutionary error.
Or, as Collins began to see it, it's a massive clue. It strongly suggests there is something outside of nature that is actively interested in goodness. Collins realized that biology was fantastic at explaining the how of the human body, but it was completely incapable of explaining the why of the moral impulse.
So he converts to Christianity. But he is still a world-class geneticist. He is literally looking at human DNA every day that clearly shows humans share ancestors with chimpanzees. How on earth does he reconcile that with the Bible?
This is where he does the heavy lifting of the good faith dialogue. He actually founded an organization called BioLogos to explore this. His specific position is known as theistic evolution, or evolutionary creation.
Break that concept down for us.
It is the belief that evolution is entirely real. It occurred exactly as secular biologists describe it: common ancestry, a timeline of billions of years, natural selection. But the entire process was intentionally set in motion and continuously directed by God. God is the grand architect. Evolution is just his chosen construction process.
So he doesn't reject Darwin at all?
Not even slightly. He famously calls DNA the language of God. He sees the staggering complexity and elegance of the genetic code as a direct act of divine creation. It's just happening over a very, very long timeline.
This position has to put him in a major crossfire, doesn't it?
Oh, he takes heavy fire from both sides. Prominent atheists like Richard Dawkins attack him relentlessly for believing in a sky fairy. And on the other side, young Earth creationists attack him for rejecting the literal 6-day creation account in Genesis.
How does he actually handle the Genesis part, the 6 literal days?
He agrees with St. Augustine again, going all the way back 1,500 years. Augustine heavily warned early Christians that we shouldn't treat the book of Genesis like a literal science textbook. It is a profound theological text about who created the world, not a technical engineering manual on exactly how he did it. Collins argues that forcing the Bible to be a science book actually disrespects the true purpose of the Bible.
That connects right back to Lemaître and the Pope. Don't force the books to be what they fundamentally aren't.
Exactly. He completely rejects scientism.
Scientism being the idea that science is the only valid way to know anything true.
Right. He argues for complementary ways of knowing. Science answers the question, how does it work? Faith answers the deeper question, why are we here?
It is a very compelling synthesis. But it isn't just theoretical philosophy. We have this stack of fascinating papers from the Faraday Institute at Cambridge, the Faraday Papers, and they take this whole good faith dialogue and they apply it to the really hard stuff today, the modern ethical stuff.
This brings us to section 6, broader implications. Because if you truly believe in both books, it completely changes how you act in the world.
Let's talk about the environment first. We have a paper here by Sir John Houghton, who is a leading climatologist.
Right. For a long time, there has been this toxic narrative in some religious circles that essentially says the world is going to end anyway when Jesus returns, so why bother saving the whales or lowering emissions?
But it's all going to burn theology.
Houghton completely destroys that idea. He argues that if God is actually the creator and the sustainer of the physical world, then the earth is quite literally God's property. Trashing the planet for short-term profit is essentially vandalism. It is a direct insult to the owner.
And he connects it to social justice, too.
Yes, very strongly. He points out that environmental degradation always hurts the absolute poorest people first. Floods, severe droughts, failing crops, they hit the most vulnerable populations hardest. So if you are a Christian who is commanded by Christ to love your neighbor, you absolutely must care about climate change. It is not a left-wing or right-wing political issue. It is a fundamental moral mandate.
Then there's the really tough one, natural disasters. This gets into the problem of pain. If God is entirely good and he created the physical world, why are there massive earthquakes that kill tens of thousands of innocent people? Professor Bob White wrote a Faraday paper entirely on this.
White makes a genuinely fascinating scientific point here. He asks a blunt question, are earthquakes inherently evil? And his scientific answer is no.
That is a very hard sell to someone who just lost their entire house.
Of course it is. And he acknowledges the immense suffering. But scientifically speaking, without the constant churning of plate tectonics, the Earth would be completely dead. Tectonics constantly recycle essential minerals. They keep the topsoil fertile. They help regulate the atmosphere over long periods. Without earthquakes and volcanoes, biological life could not exist here at all. We would be a dead rock like Mars.
So the physical hazard is actually necessary for life to exist.
The hazard is necessary, but the disaster is usually human.
What do you mean by that distinction?
White argues that a tectonic earthquake only becomes a mass disaster because humans build massive, unregulated shanty towns directly on active fault lines. We fail to enforce safe building codes because of corruption. We strip away protective coastal mangroves that would normally stop a tsunami dead in its tracks. He shifts the heavy burden from, God, why did you do this terrible thing, to, God, why did we allow this gross inequality to kill people? It becomes a direct call to human responsibility.
That is a profound perspective shift. It stops being an unsolvable theological complaint, and it starts being an actionable engineering and political challenge.
Precisely. It empowers us to fix the human side of the equation.
One last area from the Faraday papers that I want to touch on, genetic engineering. Professor Keith Fox wrote about this. We are rapidly getting to the point with CRISPR where we can literally edit human DNA. We can fix broken humans. Where do we possibly draw the ethical line?
Fox uses the core Christian mandate of healing to draw that line. Jesus spent much of his ministry healing the sick. Historically, Christians practically invented the modern hospital system, so using advanced gene editing to finally cure cystic fibrosis, that perfectly fits the religious mandate. That is restoring human brokenness back to health.
But there's a big but coming.
But enhancement is totally different. Using CRISPR to make someone 20% smarter, or 6 inches taller, or naturally more athletic. Fox argues that Ephesians crossing a dangerous line. That is playing God in a way that treats human children as commercial products to be custom designed, rather than inherent gifts to be received and loved as they are.
It's the Gattaca problem.
Exactly. It threatens to create a permanent biological caste system. Only the ultra-rich will be able to afford the genetic upgrades for their kids. It fundamentally violates the core theological idea that all humans are created totally equal in the image of God. So the good faith dialogue here acts as an ethical guardrail. It clearly says yes to medical cure, but an absolute no to vanity design.
This brings us to the end of our deep dive today, and I think we need to just zoom out for a second and look at the whole picture. We started this hour with the idea of a massive war, a loud, endless shouting match between science and religion. But what we actually found in all these sources is not a war at all.
No, it's really a marriage, a very long, sometimes very complicated marriage.
We found that the very foundational institutions of modern science, the university system, the concept of unbreakable natural laws, the deep value of physical experimentation, they all have their deepest roots firmly planted in Christian soil. We found that the warfare thesis was basically just a 19th century PR stunt by guys like Draper and White.
And we found that the most historically successful figures, giants like Boyle, Newton, Faraday, Lemaître, and Collins, they were all men who deeply respected the boundaries. They actively read both books.
I really want to circle back to that incredible Nobel Prize stat one last time. 65.4% of Nobel laureates in the 20th century identified as Christian. That is not some tiny fringe minority. That is the absolute mainstream of global scientific excellence.
It decisively proves that for many of the world's absolute brightest minds, faith and reason were never enemies. They were lifelong partners. The supposed conflict is very often just in the minds of the cultural pundits, not the actual practitioners in the lab.
So here is the final provocative thought to leave you with today. If the conflict thesis is historically just a myth, why does it persist so stubbornly? Why is it still the unquestioned default setting in our modern culture?
I think it's because the real conflict isn't actually between science and faith at all. It is a conflict between two totally different, extreme philosophical worldviews, scientism and fundamentalism.
Define those clearly for us as we wrap up.
Scientism arrogantly says science is the only valid book, ignore everything else. Fundamentalism fearfully says Scripture is the only valid book, ignore the physical evidence. They are both stubbornly refusing to read the other volume. They are both closing one eye and loudly claiming to see the entire picture.
That is a remarkably powerful image. The invitation for you listening then is simply to open both eyes, to explore the book of nature with the exact same curiosity and deep reverence as the book of Scripture.
And if you are willing to do that, you might just find, exactly like Boyle and Lemaître and Collins did, that the two books are actually telling one beautifully unified story.
That is going to do it for this deep dive. Thank you so much for listening. Go read some books. Definitely read both of them. And we will catch you next time.
Goodbye, everyone.